How does a Boeing 737 go from a standard bustling flight full of chatter and movement to a deadly silent hull cruising in the sky without a single soul on board? Were the 121 people inside just ET phone homed by a UFO, or did everyone just simply vanish into thin air mid-flight? No. The truth was even more inconceivably senseless than some complex supernatural explanation. Here's the story of Helios Airways Flight 522, the ghost plane that continued to fly for more than an hour, with no one steering it. To fully understand what happened to the infamous ghost flight, we need to start at the route it took the day before its very bizarre final flight. Flight 522 had just arrived from London at Larnaca International Airport, Cyprus on the 14th of August 2005. It was a little past 1 in the morning when they touched down, and the crew came out to report some unusual noises coming from the right aft service door. The ground engineer, Alan Irwin, checked the door and found no abnormalities. He even did a pressurization check and determined that everything was in working order. But he did make a note for the next set of pilots to double-check the cabin pressure during the next flight. This is because this very door had caused a nearly fatal issue the year before when the aircraft experienced a rapid loss of cabin pressure, forcing them to make an emergency descent. Upon landing, it was discovered that there was a hole in the door's seal the size of a grapefruit. So with that information, the new crew set off from Cyprus at 9:07 a.m. in the morning with 6 new crew members and 115 passengers on board, heading for a quick stopover in Athens before landing in Prague-Rusnia International Airport in the Czech Republic. That was the plan, at least. The pilots, Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten and First Officer Pampos Haralambous, were both highly experienced with Boeing 737s. Haralambous unfortunately did have a bit of a record of not keeping a very good eye on his standard checklists before takeoff, something he'd been reprimanded for on more than one occasion. Captain Merten's record was even worse. He's been fired from his previous job for rushing through checklists multiple times, but he had hidden this fact from Helios Airlines when he applied for the job. Merten and Haralambous also despised each other, and Haralambous was actively looking for a new job to avoid flying with Merten again. There was no outright concerning incidents, they just weren't compatible partners. Given the unusual circumstances surrounding the door the day before, they were required to check pressurization throughout the flight. Then they were delayed by a few minutes due to a flight attendant falling ill. She was replaced by another attendant, but now the two men, annoyed with each other and the delay, were even more careless with their checklists, apparently completely forgetting about the note from the engineer to check the cabin pressure. They missed the fact that the engineer Irwin switched the pressurization mode selector from automatic over to manual in order to run the pressurization check on the ground during that morning's inspection. He'd forgotten to switch it back to the automatic setting. This dial is located on the cockpit dashboard and was right in front of the pilot's eyes this whole time, and they didn't even notice it at all. They just assumed it was functioning as it had always been. The pressurization mode was no longer operating automatically, leaving the pilots to do it all manually as they climbed higher and higher and higher, which obviously they weren't, and as they rose, the air got thinner and thinner, and nobody noticed a thing. Incredulously, neither pilot noticed the multiple systems on the dashboard that clearly showed how low the pressure inside the plane was. Had the switch been on the automatic setting, the alarms would have been blaring their warnings. Instead, it was silent until they reached cruising altitude. Haralambous and Merten were so used to the system doing the work for them that they didn't even bother to check a system that they'd been explicitly warned to keep an eye on. As they reached an altitude of 12,040 feet, the rest of the background systems finally kicked in, sounding an altitude alarm. But the pilots just chalked it up to a takeoff configuration warning, which signals that the aircraft is not ready for takeoff and can sound only on the ground. The alert sound is identical for both warnings, so they just assumed that it was a glitch in the system and radioed it into ground control. ATC turned the call over to Irwin, the ground engineer, who was having trouble understanding Merten. At first, Merten mentioned the takeoff configuration alarm, but that couldn't sound unless the plane was grounded. Before waiting for a reply, he said that the ventilation cooling lights were off, another indicator that the pressure was too low to support it. Irwin was very confused by Merten's rambling explanations, which weren't making much sense, but he did ask the captain about the pressurization mode selector switch, but Merten ignored him, still deliriously focused on finding the cooling system switch. Irwin asked about the switch again, but the call had gone silent. It was 9:20 a.m., 13 minutes after takeoff. Irwin didn't realize it, but during the entire call, Merten and his first officer had been in the full throes of hypoxia, the confused dissociative state when the brain isn't receiving enough oxygen. The men were so disoriented that they probably didn't even notice that their skin had turned blue. And then they passed out, leaving ATC and Irwin to just assume that Merten was satisfied with the answers that he'd gotten from Irwin and then proceeded to end the call. Now, Merten was known for being a rather abrupt and sour sort of individual, so this wouldn't have been out of character for him. Irwin simply accepted that, clocked out for the day, and went home. The only man who could have put the pieces together, possibly in time to warn the flight attendants of what was happening, was off to catch a few hours of sleep before his next night shift. Meanwhile, the autopilot was continuing to climb them higher, quickly rising to 34,000 feet, further reducing the oxygen levels. Inside the plane, the oxygen masks had deployed, only no one was in any condition to put them on. They were fighting consciousness, also in the early stages of hypoxia, just like their dying pilots. At 9:37, they entered Athens airspace, and ATC on that side realized that they weren't getting through to Flight 522, so they reported the matter. For another 13 minutes, ATC tried to make contact with the plane, but when their scheduled stopover came and went, those on the ground realized that the plane was circling Athens in a perpetual holding pattern, causing it to fly in circles, obviously operating on autopilot. It wasn't until 10:54, 1 hour and 47 minutes after takeoff, and 1 hour and 34 minutes of flying without a pilot in any condition to fly her, that any drastic action was taken to find out what was going on with 522. It took less than 10 minutes for two F-16 jets to take to the skies, hoping to get a visual from inside the seemingly rogue plane. When they finally got a visual of what was going on inside, they reported back with horrifying news. Haralambous was slumped over his chair, Merten was nowhere to be seen, and all of the passengers were sitting motionless, with their masks hanging unused in front of them. Everyone was either unconscious or dead. The jets made a second loop to get another look, and to their astonishment, they saw a figure in a blue vest stumbling between the seats. Remember that flight attendant we mentioned earlier? The one who came in to replace the attendant who came down with an illness? That was 25-year-old Andreas Prodromou, and he just happened to be a trained pilot too, just not trained on a Boeing. For a heart-stopping moment, those on the ground had a glimmer of hope, but that hope would be shattered almost immediately. Andreas reached the cockpit, picked up the radio, and called for help. Merten had somehow, in his compromised state, switched the radio to the wrong station. Andreas's weak voice was spoken into the ether, where no one could hear or assist him, only to be heard once the black box was recovered days later.
Bank angle.
Stay there. Flight 522. Mayday.
Then he slumped over, just as the left engine blew out from lack of fuel. Even if Andreas were of a sound mind, he'd never have been able to fly the plane. He just didn't have the skills to do so. At 11:59, the right engine ceased. Andreas regained consciousness, waved to the jet, and pointed down. Even in his delirious state, he knew that they were going to crash and that he and everyone on board were going to die. Then 522 finally broke its endless loop and plummeted to the ground, heading straight for Athens. In the 3 minutes it took for the plane to make contact with the ground, going at 400 miles an hour, Andreas did one last thing that would end up saving countless lives. He steered the plane away from Athens, somehow pointing it towards a hillside just outside the city. At 9:03 a.m., Flight 522 collided with the hill. The explosion was so enormous that it flattened the whole hillside. Andreas, completely inexperienced in flying a Boeing and half-conscious, used his last reserves to save a city bustling with people. He and the 120 people, 17 of whom were just children on board, were unfortunately going to die. At this point, there was no way that he could stop that from happening, but he could prevent hundreds more from dying along with them. So, that's what he chose to do with his final seconds. The only hero on that day was Andreas Prodromou, who used his final moments on this earth to save as many lives as he could. You're about to hear the last sounds that Andreas would ever hear as he struggled to turn the yoke. He fought against winds so strong that no mortal man should have been able to turn that plane. Yet somehow, he did. Where that strength came from is anyone's guess. Let his final monumental sacrifice end our video today, because no one deserves our remembrance more than Andreas.